Hey team, welcome to the Resource Podcast. Today we're going to be speaking about relationships and love and all of those kind of things. For me, I feel it is an important part of the conversations that I've been having. It's a huge part of my journey. Without the relationships that I've had or have with, loved ones, when it comes to romantic, when it comes to just relationships and friendships, are a huge part of when it comes to us speaking about mental health. So that's why it's important for me to have this conversation. And I don't mind sharing some of the lessons that I've learned, some of the things I've done right, some of the things that I've done wrong when it comes to being in relationships or heading into one. What shaped my understanding of relationships growing up was obviously the first point of call is the relationship that you get to witness with your parents growing up. My parents, like I've said and shared with you all before, is we grew up in Northern England, and I didn't know what I didn't know, but it turns out when we were in Northern England, mum and dad were the relationship that people looked at. We'd, a family of 5, we'd be riding our bikes together, we'd be doing everything together, and people would look at them thinking, oh, I wish that I had a relationship like them. We then moved when I was 5 to Australia, and that obviously puts huge pressure on relationships. For mum, I feel like it was really isolating for her. She'd never traveled anywhere before, and so Australia was the first place that she came. And for dad, he traveled before, but when he got here, with the conversion of the money, and being able to manage the money that they had, the first thing that he had to do was go out and work away. And so what happened was there was pressure straight away on their relationship. So anything that was happening that wasn't great, or maybe they hadn't approached, or maybe they had ignored while they were bringing my sister and my brother and I up, came to a head when they were put under pressure. And so what relationships became to me was there was stress for both of them. There was, a few incidents that happened where maybe they didn't have each other's back. And mum really suffered with her mental health. Dad really suffered with his mental health. And so for the relationship that they had was just under pressure all the time. And they broke up when I was around 8 years old. But one thing I will definitely say about them is we didn't know it was happening. We didn't know they were broken up. All of a sudden, dad just wasn't there. I definitely remember feeling dad's absence. I know that he was probably trying his best to kind of come back in, and I know that maybe there was trust that was broken between both of them. But as a kid, let's be honest, I'm speaking about this in hindsight as a 39-year-old woman. As a kid, as a 5-year-old, or an 8-year-old, when they actually did break up, we were just like, what the heck is going on? And there was constantly kind of uncertainty, and there was constantly pressure that was showing up in our household. And so for me, I was ashamed when I was going to school that my parents weren't together anymore. But then I started to realize that actually it was more normal for your parents to be separated than it was for your parents to be together. A big part of the journey in that is when, over the course of, it's now been a long time since that happened. It's been 30 years. And, without sharing too much of a relationship journey that isn't mine, it's my mum and dad's, but dad never met anybody else and he was okay with it. Mum had different partners and, tried to fill that up, I suppose, fill that void. And what I saw was a lot of toxicity and her being with somebody that I don't think probably should have been around in the house that we were in. A really important part of the journey is that mum was married before dad, and he was violent and he was not necessarily a good man, but he is the father of my brother. And so that shaped the things that had happened in her past. And when mum and dad broke up, I feel like that came back and it dictated then who she then started seeing, who was in our lives. And there was a lot of things that happened. There was a lot of things that I know, given the opportunity, she might not make that decision again. But for me, in those formative years, from 8 to about 12 years old, or even going into being a teenager, what I saw in relationships was brokenness, was separation, was that, Dad wasn't around. He'd try his very best to be there, but I'd always hear, "You're just like your dad," in a negative way. And I now live with Dad, and I take that as a compliment because I love him. But when I speak about these relationships at the time, I was pretty angry that that was my perception and that was what was happening in life. And I felt like a victim. I felt poor me. I felt like nobody would understand what's happening. But since being a 39-year-old woman and having my own challenges when it comes to relationships, I give kudos to the fact that my parents did their best. They had their challenges. And while, yes, maybe they don't talk now, they did their best at the time. And I wouldn't take any of it back. And it helped me learn so much, I suppose, about myself and how I feel about relationships. I think it's important for me to acknowledge as well that when I went down the healing journey for myself around, I felt really sorry for myself. I felt, like a victim a lot of the time. And now looking back on that, at the time, I didn't feel like I was, feeling like a victim or feeling like poor me. At the time, I felt that. And I felt like the world was caving in on me when it came to relationships. And I feel like the first part of that journey is looking outwards and blaming other people as to why you're doing the things in life. And so my relationships, the first relationships that I started to have, looked a lot like the ones that mum or dad had that didn't look good. So my first few relationships really dictated or showed up in a way where I didn't value myself. I had a belief when I was younger. My first relationship was about 18, and I wasn't treated very well. I was cheated on. I was, forgotten about. I remember he was a musician, and I remember a friend of, another chick from the band who her partner was a singer, and the guys had played a gig at one location, and then they were playing another time down in Margaret River. We collected all of their equipment and we drove back down to Margaret River to make sure that they had it for the next gig. We weren't allowed to get in the door. The door person wouldn't let us in the door, even though we'd said that we were partners of the guys who were playing in the band. Why I tell this story and why it's important is my boyfriend at the time messaged me and said, "You're going to have to pay." And if I could go back to that version of myself, that was a minor thing that happened, but if I could go back to that point, that means more than just having to pay the $20 to get in that door. That meant so much more about how that person felt about me. And I now know that while it's a part of my journey, I don't deserve that and I didn't deserve that. And I wouldn't allow that again. It wouldn't even come into my realm. And so that was kind of what my relationship started to look like until I acknowledged that I needed to change the way I felt about myself or change the way that I allow other people to treat me. My biggest lesson about love, I suppose, being on the other side is that it's lovely. Having the belief that there are no good men, men are horrible, or, if you're listening that, all women are crazy, or, you've got that perception of the opposite sex or whoever you're interested in, it's simply not true. And my biggest lesson about love is you will attract what you perceive to be true. And so I brought that in and taking full responsibility for me creating the life that I thought I deserved. And so it's about taking that step back, reflecting on how I felt about myself, what I felt like I deserved, and changing that and changing the narrative so I can welcome in the person who is going to treat me the way that I deserve, and I get to treat them the same way.
Nice. Now, let's go to the opposite end. What is your biggest lesson about conflict in a relationship?
Oh, this is a good one. Good one. So my biggest lesson about conflict in a relationship is not to be afraid of it. It's actually okay. I believe now that based on the conversations that I've had, based on giving myself space and time after, previous relationships to stay single and to have self-awareness, to figure out what it is that I like, who I am outside of showing up for somebody in a relationship. The biggest thing that I've learned about conflict is that it's okay. When you find your person, if you've had shit go on with past relationships or in life in general, I do believe that there'll be conflict that the person will meet you at. And if that person's the right person, they'll stay through that. And then you get to do it with each other. There'll be conflict, but you get to grow. If somebody doesn't use, I suppose, your triggers against you, if they're not trying to cause conflict, if it's not coming from an unhealthy place, conflict can be okay. And that's the biggest thing, I suppose, that I take away from conflict in relationships is not to shy away from it. And I think if you don't shy away from it, less of it will happen. We ended up breaking up. We ended up, I've been in relationships that were good. They treated me the way that I felt like I deserved. They showed me love. However, I wasn't ready for that relationship. So we ended up not being in that relationship. And instead of me just breaking up and doing it amicably, I would project onto them the problems that I was probably going through. I now know that one of the best quotes, I think, is how somebody treats you is a reflection of how they feel about themselves, not about you. And reflecting on how I showed up in those relationships, that saying could not be more spot on. And so for me, I lost some good relationships, but something that I acknowledge and something that I know is that things happen for a reason. They built me, they're the bricks of who I am now, and they're the bricks of the relationship that I'm going to be having. And so in the relationship journey with myself is exactly that. It's acknowledging that the most important relationship you're ever going to have is with yourself. I often say, show me your partner and I'll tell you how you feel about yourself. And the only reason why I can say that is because that's exactly how it showed up in my relationships. You can see how somebody is treating you of how you feel about yourself. And not everybody's ready for this part of the conversation, but for me, I've been in relationships before where there's been, a lot of emotional abuse and there's been a lot of manipulation. And for me, I had to realize that at that point in my life, I thought that I deserved that. And to go even further, I had to ask myself, where am I doing that to that person? Relationships, good or bad, what have I learnt about communication? I would say that I'm a good communicator. And a past version of myself, a 20-year-old Becky, would say that I'm a good communicator because I communicate a lot. I'll tell you how I feel. I'll tell you what I'm doing. I'm an oversharer from way back. The difference between Becky then and Becky now is you don't need to say too much to be able to communicate. It's about saying less and being able to communicate what you want and what you need. And also part of communication, even being a speaker, the biggest part of that is to listen. Communication is two ways and we communicate in different ways. So how I receive information is completely different to how I communicate. And so understanding, like even love languages come into it. There's 5 love languages. Understanding how I communicate and how I receive communication is, I had a past partner who would give me a lot of gifts because he liked to communicate in that way. And I didn't necessarily need gifts. How I communicate, what lifts me up is words of affirmation. Tell me, but also your actions and quality time. Be with me, be present with me because I will be 100% present with you. And so figuring out when it comes to communication and where that's come from good relationships and not so good relationships, it's having self-awareness and self-acknowledgement of that as well. We are so different. The biggest thing to acknowledge as well is that men and women are different and we communicate in different ways. The guest that I want to have on when it comes to relationships is there's not only one person who can speak about relationships, because we are all so different. We all, like we said, there's so many different ways to communicate. There's so many different ways to be in relationships. So when it comes to having one guest expert, you just couldn't. And we all work differently. And so the guests that I'm going to have on are going to be speaking about it in different ways, what's worked for them, so that you can take away what you need to take away for what stage of your relationship that you're at, or what stage of the relationship you want to be in. There are parts of society definitely that I didn't realize that I was conforming to, that I was in a rush to be married and in a rush to have children. How it showed up for me was, I think I would allow not anyone in, but I wouldn't have the boundaries that I have in place now when it comes to who would even make it past a date, who I would even be speaking to, who I'd be looking for to come into a relationship. And I definitely had, more of a predisposition to somebody who was like a little bit of a bad boy. Like, I hate to admit that, but I definitely did, because in my mind, I want somebody who's stimulating, who keeps me on my toes, whereas that doesn't interest me anymore. Stability interests me. Somebody who knows who they are interests me. And what is important for me when we're speaking about relationships is somebody who's comfortable enough and self-aware enough to be able to show up for themselves first and foremost, so that they can show up for me in that relationship. They need to have their back so that they can have mine, because I'm going to be showing up for myself in that relationship so that I can show up for you. I do think sometimes you have soulmates. Sometimes there's people out there who have never dated anybody else and they meet the person and they're high school sweethearts. That hasn't been my story and that hasn't been my journey, and I know that a lot of people haven't had that. I do think it sometimes can be that you go into relationships based on the person that you are at that point. And for me, I learnt in every one of those relationships what I like and what I don't like, who I want to be and who I would like my person to be. And then to chuck something else in there, the expectations that I have, in relationships and on myself can be a lot. And so it's being prepared, I suppose, to be surprised by people. And I don't think I would have allowed myself to be surprised pleasantly by people before, because I would have showed up in a different way. Something that I want to acknowledge in relationships, and a part of relationships are marriage and children. And so for me, I've always wanted to be a mum. And I've been pregnant 3 times. 2 of those times I've terminated those babies because I didn't feel like I was good enough. I didn't feel like I had enough. The person that I was in that situation with, or in that relationship with, I didn't feel like was ready. And so I didn't end up going down that path. I don't think I acknowledged in that journey of going through a termination that I was worried about society's expectations on me and who I am to be able to show up in the world with a baby without a partner. And so I didn't. And it's been a long time in between having the opportunity to be able to be a mother again. And when I was in a relationship, I'd been in a relationship for a year. I have gone my whole life trying not to be pregnant. And so when I got into my, past relationship where I was ecstatic to finally be pregnant, I ended up having an ectopic pregnancy. And it was through that journey and grieving that journey that I realized that I was so worried about what people thought about me in bringing a child into the world that maybe I missed out on an opportunity of what could have been. And to add to that, I also trust that what will be will be. And the relationship that I get to have preceding all of those things that have happened are going to be even better. And I'm going to be an even better mother because of that. The fear of me putting that in the podcast comes from the fear of judgment still, of what people think about me, of who I was, and thinking that I was a hussy or a slut. And where I get to show up in the world now is it doesn't matter what people think of you. And the less you give a shit, the better life is. In a past relationship before where I wasn't in a good place, I didn't feel good about myself. My self-worth was probably at an all-time low. I was in a lot of debt. And this relationship that happened at that particular time, there was a lot of emotional abuse that was happening. There was a lot of stuff that my partner was going through and, a lot of mental illness that my partner was going through at the time. And I celebrate myself in calling that relationship to an end, because where it had ended up was me being isolated from my friends and family, not sharing with them the things that were happening, not sharing with them the manipulation that was happening, and all the things that I was not allowed to do, all the things that I was not allowed to say, how I would be called names or belittled or called a bitch. And where I put boundaries up now is that doesn't even fly. And where I would judge myself in that is give a person an opportunity. They're mentally not well. They're going through some stuff. It's my obligation as a partner to show up the best I possibly can for that person and stay with that person. The version of myself now is yes, but if that person isn't showing up for themselves, there is not much I can do for that person if they're not even going to do it for themselves. I wish the one thing that people understood about relationships is that to take your time, to know yourself before you enter in a relationship with somebody else. Don't pretend to be anything that you're not. Be wholeheartedly yourself. You can't go wrong. You can't go wrong. Taking your time will require patience because it might take a long time, but in the end, it's going to be worth it. The one thing that I wish I knew going into relationships when I was younger is that there's going to be times you're going to be triggering each other, but you have to trigger each other to grow. And if that person rises with you, you've got a good relationship. With the right person, it might seem a little bit challenging, but it's going to be worth it in the end. Because if you both decide to stay and you choose each other, that's where the magic happens. How I approach conflict now is I'm not necessarily dating. I don't have someone in my realm who I get to practice the things that I've learnt with. But how it shows up in, my other relationships is that radical acceptance of somebody in their flaws when they're not at their best. And where that comes from is radical acceptance of myself, radical acceptance of a person that I've been in the past, loving the women that I have been, and that all of those women get to come on the journey and they're a part of the journey and they're a part of where we're going. How I approach conflict in relationships now is I'm not in a relationship. So how I would, given the opportunity, is approaching it head on. I wouldn't leave things mulling. I wouldn't leave things unsaid, because a lot of the time, how it feels to you isn't necessarily how it feels to that person. So not being afraid to actually approach it. The importance of taking responsibility instead of blame, and where this means something to me, is acknowledging where I have absolutely blamed other people before. I was actually going to get a tattoo with a an arrow pointing back at me when I'm pointing at other people. Oh, have I been righteous in life, in relationships, in work, in the work that I do? But also learning to see people where they're at is really important. And they say, what's the quote where if you've got one finger pointing away from you, you've got three fingers pointing back. So taking that radical responsibility that what's my part in this? What can I do about this? Is this something that I can change? If not, move, get out of there. You're not a tree. One piece of relationship advice that I would give my younger self, or even further to add on to that, to my children, to my niece and my nephew, is that there is no rush. There is no rush. Don't listen to the outside noise that you have to be married, that you have to have kids at a certain time. When you are doing what you want to do, showing up in a way that you feel like your full self, you're like a magnet. But before that, if you're not showing up in the way that you are being your full self, you're doing something that you love, you feel worthy of those things, it's like you're the opposite. It's like repellent, and you start to attract people that don't align with who you are. So I suppose acknowledging that you are the most important relationship that you're ever going to have. Thank you so much for joining us on the Resource Podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, in the interest of getting it out to more people, please review and share it with 5 friends who may be struggling with a relationship or other people who might be able to pass it on to someone else.